Welcome to The Debate. Today we are diving into the sophisticated spiritual and governmental structures described in the Book of Nations. It presents a really compelling and, well, sometimes complex view of authority, particularly how it's distributed between the patriarchal and matriarchal orders.
It is a fascinating text, yeah, because it constantly hammers home this principle of unity, this idea that the two orders are, fundamentally inseparable. But then that very unity is defined by these profoundly distinct, gendered responsibilities, and it leads to this intricate system of power sharing.
And the central tension, I think the question we really want to explore today is this. Does the ultimate spiritual and temporal authority within this society fundamentally rest upon the matriarchal order as the innate spiritual foundation, or alternatively, does the structure require the functional stewardship and sort of formal commission of the patriarchal order to actually make that authority manifest in the world?
Right. And I'll be arguing that while yes, the matriarchal foundation is undeniably essential, foundational even, the necessary covenanted structure for societal progression, for defense, temporal organization, that flows primarily and formally through the patriarchal mantle. It's the mandated executor, if you will, of the unified will.
Mm-hmm. And I see why you'd think that, especially when you look at, say, the execution of law. However, I believe the evidence points more toward the matriarchal order holding that foundational primacy. They seem to possess the innate spiritual power that dictates the health, the preservation of the entire nation, acting as the bedrock upon which the entire, and let's face it, sometimes fallible, patriarchal structure must ultimately rely.
Okay, well, let's delve into those distinct roles then.
So the text establishes a profound difference in spiritual status right at birth. Women are described as coming into the earth, knowing their sacred and holy duties of service and sacrifice, whereas men have to acquire this knowledge while they are here, upon the earth. This is crucial, I think. This innate understanding immediately elevates the matriarchal order as the essential spiritual foundation, right? It's rooted in a wisdom that predates temporal existence. And this spiritual status is tied directly to their distinct matriarchal priesthood, which is explicitly noted as vital for achieving the higher spiritual attainments, specifically the terrestrial law, and being key to the 144,000 plus and translation.
That recognition of inherent spiritual knowledge is, it's powerful. I grant you that. But when we turn to governance and the functional structure, I tend to come at the evidence from a slightly different angle. The societal structure, defined by progression, defense, it seems formalized through the patriarchal mantle and succession. The text is quite clear. Patriarchs receive the blessing of the priesthood until the Lord comes. Now, that suggests a commissioned, maybe time-bound, and definitely transferable authority designed for temporal leadership.
Okay, but what about the immediate functional power of the matriarchs themselves? Isn't that present?
I acknowledge their power is immediate, yes. But its societal utility seems to require unification. The text itself qualifies the power of the matriarchs, noting it is not fully functional until they have been unified with their patriarch. Now, this doesn't necessarily make the matriarch subordinate, I don't think. Rather, it indicates the patriarchal role is the necessary activating mechanism, perhaps, required for their innate power to engage with the temporal covenant structure. And furthermore, in high governance, while the tabernacle of the matriarchs may reach a verdict, that lesser yet higher judgment, the king, who's always the patriarch, holds the final responsibility for the execution of that judgment. Judgment and execution are separate functions here, and the final temporal action is clearly the patriarch's mandate.
Okay. I think we need to interrogate that relationship more closely, though, the one between inherent spiritual status and formal commission. Because if, as the text states, women possess this complete spiritual knowledge upon entering the earth, why then do you think the very complex, very profound spiritual initiation ritual, the auditon, the name-raising process, is specifically noted as being directly for the males?
Well, that's precisely my point, actually. And it's the heart of the functional argument. If inherent spiritual knowledge were all that was required for governance, then presumably the matriarchs would rule temporally without any qualification. The necessity of the entonnoir for men suggests that while women are born with spiritual being, with innate knowledge, the patriarchal structure is necessary to formalize and activate the spiritual leadership required for temporal organization and, crucially, covenanted societal progression. It seems to be the framework for stewardship, which the men, starting from that spiritual deficit you mentioned earlier, must acquire through ritual and commission.
I'm still not quite convinced that the entonnoir proves primacy for the patriarchal order. I mean, couldn't it equally underline the men's fundamental spiritual lack? They have to acquire what the women already possess. So therefore, the two authorities are operating on, well, entirely different planes, perhaps. The inherent knowledge of women explains why their spiritual health, like, for instance, the cleansing achieved through the unity of the Moon Society, the mothers, directly dictates the spiritual health of the entire remnant population. The matriarchs function as the spiritual thermostat for the whole nation.
But a thermostat doesn't govern the house, does it?
But it dictates the environment. And we see evidence that the matriarch's authority is functionally powerful, independent of male initiation and temporal commission. Look at the specific examples of healing. The wife of Mahanri, others too, were called upon to heal the sick, even perform resurrections, explicitly using their priesthoods and authorities which were apparently immediately available and functional. This powerful, curative, even resurrection-granting authority, it strongly suggests their mandate is one of inherent spiritual capacity, not merely acquired executive function. They seem to be drawing on a source that doesn't need that formal introduction via the entonnoir.
Okay, I grant you the strength of the inherent nature argument, and the immediacy of that spiritual capacity is clear in the text. But where that argument perhaps breaks down a little for me is when we look at the specific mechanisms of national defense and preservation, especially in times of crisis. Let's pivot to those moments of apostasy and failure.
That's crucial, yes, because it's often in crisis that the true foundation of authority is revealed. And I would argue the ultimate preservation lies squarely with the matriarchs, their specific prophetic counsel given warning that fathers would become bloodthirsty. The people would be saved only because remembrance would remain with the mothers, who hold the ceremonial and covenant memory. This seems to place the ultimate preservation of the nation's spiritual identity directly on the matriarchs, particularly when the patriarchal mantle fails or, becomes corrupt.
I don't disagree that memory preservation is a sacred and vital function. Placing the spiritual insurance policy, as it were, with the mothers makes sense in that context. But national preservation often necessitates the divinely mandated and, sometimes frankly, destructive action flowing through the patriarchal order to ensure the physical environment survives long enough for that spiritual memory to be preserved. I mean, you can't preserve remembrance if the entire nation is annihilated.
That's a stark contrast you're drawing. How does that destruction flow only through the patriarch?
It seems to be a mandated executive commission. Look at Jimnahariah. He was commanded by the Lord to send his son Jimnah to destroy Jabdeel and his wicked sect, quote, by the sword to preserve an whole nation. Or Asher, commanded to smote the man, planning Lehi's murder. This commission for protective, potentially violent enforcement action appears consistently to flow through the patriarch to ensure physical survival. So while the matriarchs are holding the covenant flame aloft, you might say, the patriarchs are actively defending the city walls. One definitely needs the other to survive, but the active defense of the physical body of the nation is formalized under the patriarchal stewardship.
That brings us directly to, I think, our most complex area of tension. The actual flow of governance, specifically that interplay between judgment and execution. You focus heavily on the formal linear succession. King Raphtah passing the mantle to King Nephiel, the lineage of Levi for the highest priesthoods, which you argue places formal direction with the patriarchal steward.
Exactly. These priesthoods, like the Order of the Sun, descending through Levi and the patriarchs, are often described using metaphors of ascending steps, signifying progression and formal responsibility. The highest authority given to the people, the mantle of prophethood itself, was explicitly passed from Benjamin, the father, to his brother, Japheth. The entire historical record of succession, the maintenance of the sacred documents, it flows from patriarch to patriarch. That seems to be the formal, mandated structure for continuity.
I grant you the importance of that continuity, of course, but I think that's only half the story. That continuity is arguably conditioned by the structural unity required by the matriarchs. The entire governance system seems built specifically to incorporate the matriarchal voice as a necessary precursor to executive action. It creates a structure of shared, if distinct, sovereignty.
Okay. Define that necessary precursor more clearly.
Well, the Council of the Matriarchs determines the most severe actions, capital judicial processes. They determine what the text calls the lesser yet higher judgment. Only after the matriarchs deliver this judgment is the king, the patriarch, authorized and mandated to execute it. This implies that the patriarchal action, whether it's an execution or a declaration of war, is entirely dependent upon, conditioned by, the matriarchal decision-making which is rooted in wisdom and judgment. The king's duty looks like enforcement, but the matriarchs hold the decisive judicial power over life and death itself.
It is fascinating, isn't it, that the text is so explicit about that division, judicial wisdom residing with the matriarchs, but the lethal physical enforcement belonging solely to the king. I would frame this not necessarily as the matriarchs holding primacy, but rather as defining the precise limits of the patriarchal mandate. They provide the wisdom, the judgment, yes, but the patriarch retains the ultimate executive and temporal accountability for the action taken. He is the one commanded to smite, or to send his son to destroy. This suggests the ultimate responsibility for maintaining peace and order in the temporal realm falls squarely upon the steward who must physically act.
But if the patriarch were to act without the matriarchal mandate, which as we noted happens during times of apostasy, his action is immediately defined as wicked, as bloodthirsty. Conversely, the matriarch's spiritual authority, which is innate, stands ready to cleanse and preserve when that executive branch fails. Doesn't that ultimately make the matriarchal structure the essential, unshakable foundation, providing that spiritual insurance, that judicial veto power, while the patriarchal structure is perhaps merely the commissioned, yet inherently riskier vehicle for temporal action?
Or it makes the patriarchal structure the one bearing the formal responsibility for governance and defense outlined in the covenant. The source material is full of examples where, yes, spiritual vitality comes from the matriarch, but the historical record is carried and the laws are executed by the patriarch. This structure seems designed to ensure that both spiritual wisdom and temporal enforcement are required, creating a genuine dual sovereignty rather than perhaps the absolute primacy of one over the other.
So our discussion has really, I think, illuminated the complexity of the shared sovereignty. Ultimately, from my perspective, the evidence points to the matriarchal order holding the innate, the cleansing, the stabilizing power. They possess the spiritual knowledge from the foundation of the world, and they hold that covenant memory which acts as the spiritual foundation, ensuring the nation's survival, especially when the patriarchal mantle falters. Their judgment appears to be the necessary higher precursor to the state's significant physical actions.
And yet, the structure is clearly defined by covenanted unity. But the functional mandate for temporal leadership, the execution of divinely sanctioned actions, the explicit responsibility for physical defense, and the formal structure of priesthood succession, these rest formally and functionally with the patriarchal steward. The matriarch is the essential co-ruler, yes, the keeper of the spiritual standard, absolutely. But the patriarch is the commissioned executor of the covenant, and ultimately the one who must answer for the nation's physical preservation and temporal order.
Which brings us back, inevitably, to the text's own cornerstone, the concept of unity, reinforcing that one is not without the other, and the other without the one.
Exists precisely because both orders bear unique and, it seems, non-transferable authority. Innate spiritual foundation on one side, formalized executive stewardship on the other. It leads to a deep system of shared power that really requires understanding both roles to fully appreciate the law and structure of their God.